Welcome to a somewhat late 4th birthday video for version 5 of the CB&Q in Wyoming. I'm Mark Pruitt. This layout has been under construction for 4 years now. The Burlington mainline is complete and attention has turned to staging and the Cody branch. The layout is hosting regular operating sessions. Let's take a look at progress on the layout over the past year, beginning with a brief recap of the first 3 years of construction. On June 25, 2020, most of the construction work on the basement was complete and I was able to begin work on the layout. I started simply enough, digging the bench work for Casper out of storage and reassembling it. By June 25th of 2021, the layout's first birthday, Casper Yard was functional. I'd incorporated most of the changes I made to it for the new layout and installed the skyboard along the walls. The C&W line above Casper was mostly installed, with final scenery on that shelf about to begin. Casper was still on casters, so I could roll it out of the way while working on the line above. By the second birthday, June 2022, Casper was permanently installed against the walls and significant progress had been made extending the main line west out of Casper to Powder River, through the Wind River Canyon, and into Thermopolis. The basic scenery shell of the canyon was also beginning to take form. The main line had been punched through almost to Worland, and the C&W line had extended all the way through Showbone to Riverton and on to Hudson. By the layout's third birthday, some detailed scenery in Casper was almost complete, though there was still a lot to go. Powder River stock pens were set in place, and the scenery shell in the Wind River Canyon was progressing at an agonizingly slow pace. The Burlington mainline had pushed through Worland and Basin into Grable. Some of the trackage leading to the Cody branch on the lower level of the layout was in place. The Lander benchwork above Grable was built, and the Paposia mine spur just outside of Hudson, a late addition to the track plan, was built. So we come to this past year. We've settled into a routine of 3 operating sessions per year. We held one on June 27, 2023, 2 days after the layout's third birthday. That operating session showed me that the layout was terribly short of both rolling stock and motive power, so the 4th year of layout construction saw a concerted effort to address those throughout the year. 45 new pieces of rolling stock were added to the fleet. These are just a few of them. 6 new locomotives were added to the roster, and several others were purchased that are awaiting upgrades before going into service. Several of the new locomotives required new lettering, and one required significant mechanical and electrical work as well. Right after that operating session in late June, I began building the lead from Grable down to west staging. I reached a point under the east end of Douglas, where Douglas will be, and stopped for the time being. I had several of the yard tracks built right into Grable by the layout's third birthday, but that yard was nowhere near complete. In July, I added more of the yard tracks, and by early August, Grable trackage was complete except for roundhouse tracks and the local fueling tracks. In July, I also started working on detailed scenery around Rocky Mountain drilling in Casper. This would take several months of off and on work to get the area close to finished. I 3D printed and then detailed a couple of small houses I designed based on houses I saw in North Casper. I placed the houses behind the Rocky Mountain drilling spur in the corner, and with the addition of some foliage, vehicles, fencing and such, the scene was really coming together. But there was still more to do, like lighting and hiding the scene between the layout and the backdrop. In mid-August, I added a third small house to block the view of the road ending at the backdrop, and spent some time adding weeds and grass to the pipe yard for Rocky Mountain drilling. That yard still needs a lot more clutter. Later in August and in early September, I added signs to Rocky Mountain drilling based on a photo I have of the prototype. Then I set about lighting the houses. After several hours of trial and error, this is the final result. The final step for now was to add an under-counter LED light over the area. When on full bright, this dimmable LED makes the area look like noon on a blazing hot summer day. I was working on a lot of different parts of the layout all at once in August. Along with Grable track work and Rocky Mountain drilling scenery, I was busy with preparations to install fascia around the end of the Wind River Canyon Peninsula. This was a big job. In order to figure out where the ends of the fascia sheets would land, I had to temporarily install the sheets further up the canyon. Then I spent a few days installing supports for the fascia. The sheets at the end of the peninsula would be on the large side, so I needed beefy supports to hold them securely. On the 17th, Dave came down from Basin and helped me mount the Douglas backdrop. Once that was finished, we turned our attention to the fascia at the canyon. We quickly discovered that we needed to modify the supports to allow the fascia to curve smoothly around the end, so we did some surgery to the benchwork, cutting away the sharp corner and adding a chamfer. We ran out of time and Dave had to leave before we got the fascia mounted, but over the next couple of days, I managed to get it in place by myself. With the fascia mounted, I spent several days cutting up pink foam insulation boards and stacking up the canyon walls all the way around the end of the peninsula. By the end of August, the canyon looked like this. In early September, I spent a couple days installing the backdrop supports for Thermopolis, and then began extending the west staging lead from the west end of Douglas to roughly where it would open up into the staging yard under Casper. By the middle of the month, I had the west staging sub-roadbed installation finished, and a couple days later ran a train down to the end of the staging lead. With the staging lead complete, I switched gears and went to work on the Powder River stock pens. I was ready to scenic that area. I haven't had a good disaster for a while, so I was about due. The third week of the month, I added the brown tile grout I thought would make good dirt to the pens. I figured the foam core the pens were built on would handle the moisture from the grout without any problem. I couldn't have been more wrong. As the grout dried, the foam core twisted and curled up like a pretzel. As the foam core warped, sections of the stock pens moved with it, and a lot of the posts lifted right off the board. I took the pens off the layout and set them on the table in the library. You can see the warpage in this photo, as well as the post that lifted up, but even this picture doesn't show how bad it really looked. I almost threw the entire project away at this point, but I'd spent so many hours scratch building the pens, I decided to see if I couldn't salvage it before just giving up completely. I glued the pens with the foam core onto a sheet of masonite and left everything to dry for several days. The masonite seemed to flatten out the foam core pretty good, so I took the entire thing back to the layout and laid it in place. It looked promising, so maybe I could save the pens. At this point, I left them alone for a while. I wouldn't get back to them until the middle of November. In between battling with the stock pens, I continued working on the canyon. First, I trimmed the fascia using a roto zip. Then I began adding additional foam and began trimming it. Tunnel number 3, the short tunnel right at the end of the plaster cloth, was added at this point. It was time to make a big mess again. First, I used a hot wire cutter to trim the sharp corners and edges off the foam. Then I used a Sureform tool to rip up the smooth surfaces and give the coming plaster cloth something to grab a hold of. That was the end of work on the canyon for about 5 weeks. In late September, With the west staging lead now in place under Douglas, I began installing the Douglas sub-road bed. This went fairly quickly. In only about 3 days, I had it all installed, graded, and fully supported. In early October, I was finally able to extend the mainline east out of Casper. I had been waiting to do this for several years. I worked both from Casper east and from Orange/Grable west. On October 9th, I laid the last piece of track in the Burlington mainline. The visible mainline was now complete. After another day to wire the newly installed track, I ran a train around the entire line. 3.5 years after construction began, a train could finally circumnavigate the whole layout. I had an operating session coming up on October 24th, so I spent the next couple weeks in preparation. I added some temporary roundhouse tracks to the Grable turntable and added the skyboard behind Thermopolis. I removed all the crap off the layout and cleaned the track, then cleaned the room itself. Finally, I generated all the train manifests and staged the trains. The layout was ready. Because several of the operators travel for several hours to be here, the session has become more than just getting together to run trains. Some of the folks bring their wives with them, so we make a day of it. People begin arriving about 9:30 in the morning, and at 11 o'clock we head to Pizza Ranch for lunch. This session was special because one person, Johnny Everett, came all the way from Port St. Francis, South Africa to attend. He has friends in the US and Canada, so he scheduled his visit to North America to coincide with my operating session. I was honored to have him. After lunch, we all gathered in the train room at 1 o'clock. Well, except for the ladies. They all went shopping for the afternoon. I gave a tour of the layout for the new folks, and we got started. For the next 2.5 hours, the layout came to life. Although lacking in scenery and with much track work still to be done, there was plenty to keep everyone busy moving freight and passengers across the road. Everyone said they had a great time, and I guess it's true because they all came back again in March. Well, except for Johnny. The travel time and expense make the trip impractical for him on a regular basis. Once the session was over, it was back to work. I took the first steps in converting an old brass locomotive to DCC, but I'll cover that project all in one fell swoop in a minute. For now, I began adding new plaster cloth in the canyon to all that foam I'd placed in September. Following that, I applied tinted hydrocal on top. In early November, I also got back to the stock pins. I glued the post back down and fixed other pieces that had come loose. Then I very carefully added new tile grout, this time making sure to add water only sparingly. The grout worked great this time, but the edges of the foam core were very apparent. After the grout was thoroughly dry, I smoothed on some caulk to fill the gap between the scenery and the foam core, and the next day added a bit more grout. Not absolutely perfect, but certainly good enough to carry on. Then it was back to the canyon again to add even more plaster cloth and hydrocal. On November 27th, Dave came down from Basin again. We spent most of the day adding scenery around the stock pins. There's still more to do here. I want to add a pole light or two, and the pens need things like watering troughs, some hay and straw, and of course all sorts of cow patties in the pens and around the area. I spent the last of November renumbering a C&W 10-wheeler I'd bought in late 2022. I already had one numbered 236, so I renumbered this new one to 1395, which is one of the 10-wheelers that the C&W actually ran from Casper to Lander. It's been decades since I'd last applied decals to a model, so this was kind of a first for me. It came out better than I had any right to expect. After finishing that loco and building a couple of tank cars, I removed the unpainted fascia from Powder River around to almost the end of the Canyon Peninsula and painted it. A few days later, I reinstalled it and reinstalled the location names. One of the comments I'd gotten from the last ops session was that people would lose track of which way was east and west, so I rounded out the rest of 2024 by making and installing direction signs at each location. Now let's get back to that brass locomotive I mentioned earlier. This is a model of the Burlington's S2 class of Pacific locomotives used primarily in passenger service. The model was built in Japan in the mid-1960s for L.M. Bloom. It didn't run, but after my experience with the Athearn Pacific a few years ago, I figured I could get it operational. Besides, I got it for a very good price. Right after the October operating session, I began disassembling the locomotive. I photographed every single step through the process, including taking a picture of every screw I removed. I wanted to be able to get this thing back together. In short order, I found out why the loco didn't run. It was what I'd hoped would be the case. The plastic coupling between the motor and the worm had turned brittle with age and broken. This should be an easy fix. As it turned out, the mechanical drive was not very well constructed. There was a huge amount of lash in the worm shaft, which I would need to correct if I wanted the unit to run well. I installed some washers on the worm shaft to take up the slop. I knew I'd have to replace the old open frame motor to convert the loco to DCC, and I'd ordered a suitable one off eBay a couple of months earlier. I added a silicone tube coupling between the new motor and the worm shaft and attached the motor to the loco frame with adhesive caulk. Once the caulk dried, I hooked up an old MRC power pack and ran the mechanism. I tweaked the valve gear, crosshead guides, and rods until the mechanism ran without binding. All this work was done between late October and mid-November. Then I set the loco aside until after the new year. After the first of the year, I began the decoder installation with disassembly of the tender. I modified the shell to allow the wires to run from the locomotive connector to the decoder inside the shell. Then I spent several hours cutting holes in the tender bottom for the speaker. This isn't pretty, but it works and no one will see it anyway. Next, I attached the connector to the front of the tender frame. After that, it was just a matter of wiring everything up and reassembling it all. Once reassembled, the locomotive looked pretty good and it did run, but there were a few kinks to be worked out. I made up some electrical wipers for the tender trucks to improve power pickup and replaced the far too bright headlight with an LED. I shortened the wires in the locomotive cab to reduce the clutter there, and in late February added some bismuth metal to the cab roof to better balance the locomotive over the drivers and improve tractive effort. All total, I probably spent close to 100 hours getting this loco onto the layout and operating well, but it was sure worth it. In the third week of January, I began adding rock castings to the south end of Wind River Canyon. I'd done a few way back in June of 2022, so it was well past time to do more. After about a week of that, I stopped again, though not for another 18 months this time. Late in January and into early February, I installed sub-road bed for Powell under Worland. This wasn't easy. I had to remove this forest of supports under Worland and install new supports to clear Powell. In mid-February, I took the unlettered consolidation I'd acquired a few months earlier and decaled it for the Burlington, giving it locomotive number 3188. Like the CNW 10-wheeler I did earlier, this locomotive was listed as assigned to the Casper division in 1935. In mid-February, I was back to the rocks at the south end of the canyon. I worked on it intermittently until mid-March, when I was at this point. Most, but not all, of the rock castings are now in place at this end of the canyon. For most of the last half of February, I fought with 2 different Windows 11 laptop computers trying to get Decoder Pro to communicate with my NCE system. This was frustrating in the extreme. Decoder Pro would not talk to the COM port my NCE system was hooked into, and there was no indication as to why. I did finally get it to work by downloading and installing third-party COM port drivers. Turned out the drivers provided by Microsoft for Windows 11 don't even work. I had the second laptop working finally for one night. The next day when I tried to start Decoder Pro, I got this message. I gave up and bought a cheap Windows 10 laptop from Amazon. I loaded Decoder Pro and it connected to my system with no problem at all. I hate computers. In early March, I was laying the first tracks into Powell, testing the transition out of the helix as I went. A few days later, I was laying out track center lines farther down in Powell. Then it was time once again to get ready for an operating session. This session was held on March 21st. As before, all who were interested gathered at Pizza Ranch for lunch before we started. Then it was back to the house for the trains. This was the first session where most of the staging trains were running, and Casper became a huge bottleneck. At one point, we had trains backed up 2 deep in both directions waiting to get into the yard. It all worked out in the end though, and for the next session I resolved to block the trains properly and prepare Casper Yard so the operator didn't have to cherry pick the cars out of the yard to go onto the trains. After the session was over, I got to work on the permanent staging yard. I started by building the 10 turnouts needed for the double-ended 6-track yard. In early April, I built the benchwork for the yard. There were 4 panels, each 16 inches wide. 3 were 8 feet long, and the 4th was about 6.5 feet long. Once the panels were complete, I temporarily assembled them to mark out the tracks. I had to do this on the driveway. It's the only place big enough to assemble the entire yard. I learned that a chalk line doesn't work too well over a 31-foot distance, so I just marked the center track with a Sharpie and left the rest to be marked as I installed track on each panel. I started track laying on the 17th of April, laying the west end yard throat. Since none of this will be scenic, I simply added spacers under the rails rather than waste tie blocks for those turnouts. I wired each panel as I finished track laying and installed the occupancy detectors for each track. Then I installed the tortoise switch machines. These are the only powered turnouts on the entire layout. Over the next few weeks, I finished laying track and adding the control components to all 4 panels. On the last day of April, Dave came down again, this time to help me run the east staging yard lead from near Grable to a point under Powder River. All went well until we reached the point where the lead would run under the Wind River Canyon benchwork. That's when it all fell apart. When I was planning the lead, I neglected to take into account the thickness of the benchwork. The lead would run right smack into the stringer. There was no practical way to fix this problem, so a redesign was needed. Dave suggested taking the east staging lead off the Cody branch track at the bottom of the helix. While not ideal because of the grade in the helix, it was the only solution. On May 1st, I added the new turnout for the staging lead. Once again, I had to do some modifications to the whirling supports to push the new staging lead all the way down the peninsula behind Powell. But I was lucky in that the supports I'd reworked back in January provided a clear path for the lead most of the way. I did have to make a few changes farther down, but all in all, not a whole lot. I got the sub-road bed laid through that jungle of supports and wires in just a couple of days. Then it was back to finishing up the last of the staging yard panels. The east end yard throat was finished on May 12th with the installation of the occupancy detectors and tortoise switch machines. Dave came down yet again on May 14th to help me assemble the now completed staging yard. We carefully spliced each section to the others using 3-foot 1x3 stringers across the joints. That job took most of the day, much longer than I expected. But by the end of the day we were finished. The yard was now one big piece laying on the floor. Lifting the yard into position turned out to be a major job that involved disassembling the sections again, lifting them up onto plastic bins one at a time, then reconnecting them all. With the yard off the floor, I now had clearance to install the permanent supports, threaded rods that suspend the yard below Casper. Then I added the electrical cables to most of the connections on the yard. These will all run to the control panel. In late May and into early June, I connected the yard leads to both ends of the yard. Even though the yard still needed adjusted vertically and grades set on the leads, I was able to run a train all the way from the west lead across the yard and over to Powell at the end of the east lead. In mid-June, I set the yard at its final elevation, adjusted it for flatness, graded the leads at both ends, and added the permanent risers for those. While laying the tracks on the yard leads, I also started reworking the old staging yard control panel I'd built for version 2 of the layout some 17 years earlier. I gutted the old panel, removing the LEDs and switches from the face, and discarded most of the internal wiring. I designed a new panel face and had it printed. Then it was time for the next operating session. On June 25th, the 4th birthday of the layout, a group of friends from all across the state of Wyoming gathered once again to run the layout. As I had planned after the last session, I blocked the trains and organized the yards. This time there was no huge bottleneck at Casper. Everything seemed to run smoothly. The next session is planned for October 22nd. I hope you enjoyed this slightly delayed look back at the layout through its 4th year of development and operation. What will year 5 bring? More construction, to be sure. I hope to progress significantly with the Cody branch and maybe even begin laying track into Lander on the CNW. Scenery progress will be more of a priority this year as well. Then there will be the operating sessions. If you're going to be in Casper, Wyoming in late October, March, or June, and who isn't, after all this is the crossroads of America, let me know. You'll be more than welcome to join in to run some trains. No experience necessary. Thanks for joining me on this review of the 4th year of the layout. Be sure to tune in for the usual monthly updates in the future, plus the occasional operations episode and maybe a few other videos from time to time as well. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe and happy model railroading. See you soon.